for the real. Once in a lifetime. Yeah. Rapper had to earn my stripes like black zebras. Rap Jesus, dark-skinned nigga with a black season. Plus my only communion was gram slinging. Black man know that he trapped, but he stayed dreaming. But nature won't nurture the womb of a black mother. Rap love is trapped in a trap with Pat's mother. He raps and still hustle. Better than traps and raps with gram shuffle. I got a mind full of free power. Thunderstorms and a few showers. We'll take yours cause we need ours. We from the dirt, we beneath flowers. You out of pocket, that's your man white. You gon' rob me, that's your man, right? You gon' have to slide him, that's the plan, right? All cause you ain't spend your bread right. Snake nigga.
Hey yo, you still got them thing stats?
Yeah, you know I got that shit for
what up?
Right? Come on, bro. You know I always got that shit on low. You know me, nigga. You know I get down.
Good this morning. What up?
Shit.
Get a couple more people in the room. We'll get to it.
I mean, you need, nigga. Matter of fact, let me get all of them, nigga. All of them. Matter of fact, get on the fucking floor, nigga. Get it, bro. You offended, he put a strap on you.
What's good, man? This morning, to the morning convo, we gonna chop it up. We're gonna get to it. Like I always tell y'all, you know what I'm saying, we still selling the B8 shirts. Like the one I got on, you know what I'm saying? YouTube. At the end, if y'all ever miss these videos when I be playing them, they will be on YouTube later. But we're going to start off with 3 videos. America's Egypt, City of God Kings, and then what was Britain's role in slavery. You know what I mean? So I'll probably be on from now on from the morning time until about 11:30. But if y'all miss it, you know what I'm saying, just recap it or go on YouTube, all right? But let's get to it. We're going to start with America's Egypt.
Extraordinarily powerful evidence to suggest that this is so. If you were amongst the survivors of a high civilization and you had been, your civilization had been destroyed in an enormous cataclysm, and you wanted somehow to keep the memory of your civilization preserved and to pass down the knowledge to the future, and you might particularly want to do that if you believe passionately in the reincarnation of the soul, by the way.
No one could think about Egypt or Freemasonry without thinking about pyramids. Inherently, they have become the symbolic representation for both. But why? According to the historical narrative, Egyptian hieroglyphics were completely unknown until the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon and the French. Even more astoundingly, Egyptian history had magically disappeared for over 3,000 years when fragments are recovered from the rubble in Rosetta. Those fragments are identified as the last credible remnants of the ancient Egyptian civilization. However, the recovered fragments can only be traced to an area in Egyptian history when it was ruled by the Greek. Authentic Egyptian history predates Ptolemaic rule. So the idea that the Rosetta Stone could be considered a credible remnant of ancient Egypt is far from the truth. Even if the Ptolemaic dynasty hadn't sought to change the language, which they did, as maintained by Egyptologists, the pyramids would even predate the Ptolemies by over 2,000 years. The question should be asked, how could the Egyptian culture and language have become lost when that area had been ruled by Arabs and the Caliphate for over 1,000 years before Napoleon invades Egypt?
In 1905, Breasted wrote that studying early burials in Egypt had, quote, produced such a diversity of opinion among physical anthropologists as to render it impossible for the historian to obtain decisive results from their researches, end quote. In 1916, in Ancient Times, he sensibly described modern peasants in the Delta as both brown and as descendants of ancient Egyptians. The brown label sidestepped the insistence of many white Americans that except for American Indians and East Asians, you had to be either black or white.
Shouldn't the Egyptians, aka Arabs, have known about Egyptian history before the Europeans? So all of these ancient grandiose monuments sit abandoned in the desert in the middle of a trade highway between 3 continents, and they were never studied or surveyed by the Arab population who had been living in the region for at least 1,000 years. How is it possible that supposed native Egyptians knew nothing about Egyptian culture or language until the invasion of the French? The Rosetta Stone and the pyramids had been there for thousands of years, yet the same people credited with some of the world's most advanced knowledge hadn't.
You're not a dish.
We always gonna have them commercials. Let's get to it. What up, man? Y'all been quiet lately. Let me get some comments. How y'all feeling?
Hadn't even cared to take a peek at a pyramid wall. That virtual indifference to one of the 7 wonders of the world seems literally impossible. Even now, the most prominent Egyptologists struggle to reconcile inconsistent chronologies as it pertains to simply dating ancient Egypt. But those same Egyptologists do not struggle with one chronological aspect. The pyramids were built thousands of years ago. This point seems to have universal agreement across the world of academia. Most Egyptologists agree that the pyramids are at least 4,000 years old, and many have asserted that they are possibly 100 times older. In addition to the expounded antiquity, these same academics claim these pyramids were built by an advanced civilization whose knowledge was lost until the discoveries made by France and Egypt. Their claim is that the advanced knowledge used in their construction has not and was not used at any point between then and the 1790s. These are their 2 central points of deception when it comes to these monuments: their age and the sophistication of the process in which they were built. Both points are complete lies. The pyramids were not built thousands of years ago, and the high technological sophistication supposedly used to build the pyramids is also an untruth. The academic narrative surrounding the pyramids and ancient Egypt is full of holes, and those holes are brought to you from the hands of Jesuits and Freemasons. Quote, "The cradle of symbolism used in all masonry is placed by many of the best authorities in that country which they believe was first inhabited, i.e. the plateau of Tartary, and from there transmitted to this generation by the sages of India, Persia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. We are not indebted to either ancient Egypt for either religion or masonry, but to America. It is a fact that at Memphis, Egypt, in the pyramids, under the guidance of the kings, the mystic rites of masonry were worked many thousands of years ago. But at that time, Egypt and the continent of America were one and the same. In America, rediscovered in the 15th century and repopulated in the 17th, was recovered Egypt and the promised land, or land of the constellation of the eagle. Study of the American constellations Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Capricornus reveals the immemorial antiquity of the name America and the significance of the arms of the United States. The fact once recognized that it is impossible to separate the eagle from America, the land shadowed with wings of Isaiah, over which accordingly appear two grand eagles. The red swan flying down the Milky Way, and the winged steeds, Pegasus and Equus, all the wings known to astronomy, without taking the bear from Russia, Perseus from Persia, and a flood of light is poured upon the history and mythology, and where heretofore much has been vague and inscrutable, now we are able to at least see men as trees walking. When following the course of the constellations, those immovably and perpetually fastened upon America are reached. It will appear, while all that is sublime in the historic past centers upon Egypt, all that is sublime in the prehistoric past centers upon America. Atlantis, as the curtain which has hitherto concealed the prehistoric connection between the peoples of ancient Egypt and America, is lifted. It will be seen that the people of the eagle on the Nile, being descended from the original people of the eagle on this continent, the twain are one, and that prehistoric America was the original Egypt, or Eagle Land, prior to the mighty dispensation in the days of Peleg, when the earth was divided and the great globe itself was nearly rent asunder." End quote. Quote, says Agassi, "First born among continents, America has been falsely denominated the New World. Hers was the first dry land lifted out of the waters. Hers was the first shore washed by the ocean that enveloped all the earth besides, while Europe was represented only by islands. Rising here and there above the sea, America, Atlantis, already stretched in an unbroken line from Nova Scotia to the far west."
So he's saying that in history, these are documents written by Masons, and they saying that America was Atlantis. Outside of Africa, after the disasters, the first land that popped up out the water was America. They call it the New World, but it actually is the Old World. You know, it's ancient. That's why they would say Atlantis was the first land outside of Africa to emerge up out of the waters, is what they're saying. It's like a lot of history. That's why I was showing y'all the other day that was showing you the documentary in Mississippi, and the Mississippi and Memphis and all that shit. And I was showing y'all all of this for a reason. Damaris, what up?
absolute fact that secret societies play a major yet clandestine role in world literature, history, science, and politics. But in the case of Egypt, we will focus on architecture, specifically the construction of the pyramids. As any Egyptologist will tell you, the pyramids were built using perfect mathematical calculations. Even their astronomical alignments were accurate. This same Egyptologist will also tell you the knowledge used to build the pyramids was lost and recovered in the 1790s. That is a literal 3,000-year blackout on a viable system of measurement. How could anything of architectural integrity have been erected anywhere within the area of Egypt, Europe, or the Middle East before the 1700s? If the pyramids were truly considered a wonder, who was wondering before the 1500s? Because the pyramids don't even begin showing up on maps until after 1500s. Even early classical historians like Herodotus, who wrote of the pyramids, had his own doubts, according to a Greek translation. In the literal translation of the text, he is told that stones and levers are used in the raising of cut rocks and the erecting of the pyramids. This example means Herodotus' history of the Egyptians is completely fraudulent. It has already been proven that pyramids were not constructed in the method described in the text, unless he was describing the pyramids in America, which are actually constructed with cut stone. Nonetheless, his accounts have become less credible through our discoveries in reality. If our speculations are true, we can clearly see Herodotus, a literary implant who created a completely false narrative involving the construction of the pyramids, to the point his accounts are propped by Egyptology as truth concerning the construction of said pyramids. It should be important to note that Herodotus lived a full 2,000 years after the supposed construction of the pyramids. Most Americans don't even know how the Oroville Dam was built, which was less than 100 years ago. Those very same Americans don't know that without those dams, Central California would be underwater. Half the state would be a saltwater sea. If the
See, so let me just give you an example. Y'all remember what happened to Katrina? And when the levees broke? When the levees broke, I'm gonna show you.
Underwater.
When the levees broke, it's a natural disaster, but really a lot of these states in America are supposed to be underwater. You see this green area right here? This is basically like the only part of California that wouldn't be underwater, right? And on the ancient map I found 2 years ago, since all of this right here would be underwater, basically, this was the Red Sea on the ancient map. This area right here. So the only part of California that wouldn't be underwater is this, if you get an idea without the levees being built. So it's a lot of America, including parts of, like I was saying, New Orleans. But when the levees broke in Hurricane Katrina, that's what happened. When them levees break, it put the cities back up underwater. You know what I mean? It looked like the hurricane was bad, but New Orleans, when they tell you, like, you know, New Orleans is like 7,000 feet below sea level, that's what they're talking about, below sea level. They redirected the water and holding it back so that they can have more land. You know what I'm saying?
If the average American doesn't know this, how could Herodotus or any Egyptian know how something was built 2,000 years ago without the proper records, which were lost for over 3 millennia? And I'm not talking monsters. geometric details exhibited in these monuments were obviously indicative of an ancient civilization to everyone who knew nothing of the Americas. This high civilization recovered from the ashes of extinction brought new light into the world. But which world did it bring light into? And what was recovered?
That right there, now that's what I be telling y'all. That's in America. These are so old that nature took it back. So imagine if you got all these ancient structures, but these structures so old that grass and life started growing over top of these structures. Well, you would think they call them mounds. But if you was to cut down the mounds like a haircut, you would end up with stone. You know what I mean? That's why you see South America. That's like one of the bottom foundations of an old pyramid. Just like in South America in the pyramids of the sun. So a lot of these places, when they go inside of these things to find out because they don't tell you this, they find tombs of like what they would call the same thing as the pharaohs inside of these things.
From the ashes. And from whose ashes was it recovered?
Edwin Blashfield's mural, Evolution of Civilization, anticipated by 2 decades the outline of Breasted's textbook. Egypt and America sit side by side in Blashfield's painting because Egypt is the origin of civilization, which progresses around the dome to its climax in America.
You know, when I was watching this, the reason what made me catch my eye to this was, one, we know that Mary in the Bible, Mary's mother was Ruth, because we know the story of the Bible and the true person is separate, right? We know that Mary's mother name was Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite queen. Moabite is the bloodline of the Moors, which own the state of the Americas. So when you hear a lot of these stories, understanding that Yeshua and a lot of these things, that's what I be trying to tell you. It's so much to decode in this. That's why I'm not telling you what to believe. Use your eyes and let you figure it out. But it's a lot more information. The land of milk and honey, ain't no cows in Africa. It wasn't originally before the trading.
We ain't build no slave ship. We ain't make those anchors. We ain't plot those grave sites. Up since daylight, word about the things we try to make right. It's gonna be a late night. So much turmoil makes my blood boil. Kundalini, encore. Earth is sunbroad, dirt is unsoiled. With more core, tell a story that's some sport. Watch it unfold, stories untold. Copyright unsold, books with one spine. Ghosts with one soul. They want control, you want control. But we share one goal, we fight one foe.
That's Mount Rushmore right here, right? Now, you hear the word. I'm just showing you how much this word keeps bouncing around, and I bring this up to y'all. Where Trump did the speech right here, where they put the president faces, it's called Mount Rushmore. The invasion of Russian the Moors on their land.
Satchel front door, and it keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking, yeah. It keeps knocking, but the people kept rocking, yeah. Can't stop, flex, whatever they do. They can't stop, keep knocking, yeah. They can't stop us.
And you see right here, a lot of the old Egypt shit would be underwater because the Nile is growing. So a lot of that shit be underwater. So they have to like reconstruct these buildings. Now they say they don't know how they build these buildings, but yet they've taken a lot of these shits apart and moved them uphill. So clearly, if they have taken them apart, then they clearly know how it was put together. You know what I'm saying? It's just reverse engineering. But I want to show you how they had to take the, like, what they were saying, they didn't know how to build it, so they cut the faces off and moved it piece by piece. and put it back. But who's to say what they did to this shit, or did they change anything?
No, they can't stop us. No, they can't stop us.
It is hard to believe how the largest ancient structures in North America could ever have been misinterpreted as geological forms, even though hundreds of years of weather and vegetation had obscured them. We now know that Western Illinois was once home to America's largest prehistoric population at a site we call Cahokia. And yet this ancient monument was just barely saved from being plowed under.
It was in the 1920s that Warren K. Moorhead, an archaeologist, came here to help the effort for the state to acquire this property. He did this by excavating in the mounds, some places between the mounds, to find objects, pottery, worked shell, flint work, that would demonstrate that these mounds were not only lived upon by Indians
In Chicago.
but they were built by Indians, and that these were man-made, these were artificial. In the case of Monk's Mound, it was almost a magic mountain.
Monk's Mound is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the entire Western Hemisphere. Its base covers over 14 acres. It stands 100 feet high and has several terraces. Excavations have revealed that there was a huge building at the top. This construction was over 104 feet long and about 48 feet wide. A room at the top where the paramount ruler would have lived and governed his community, as well as being the setting for ritual and ceremonial acts.
All right, let's stop right here. This is the bullshit that they'll do. He's showing you shit he found. Not the guy doing the documentary, but see who they put here? See, when you go back, the Indians, most of the Indians in America, for record, and check me if you think I'm lying, most of the Indians were like the mixtures of the Africans that already had came here, or what we call Africans, because that's how people understand, and the Folsom people that came across the top, like, you know, when it was closer. And those like the people, that's like the mixture. Their kids, the foreigners lived on the outskirts. You know, the 13 colonies, Florida, you know, they lived on the outskirts, the same place where they put the Europeans. But as you came inward, you was dealing with more darker people in America, like, you know, the Midwest, right? So they're going to show you these pictures of Indians, but always keep in mind, just like I showed y'all yesterday, that these are dark-skinned people. These people of color, of different color tones, did not even exist at this time.
Activities.
We estimate that there's at least 22 million cubic feet of earth in Monk's Mound.
And ever since when was Indians building mounds and pyramids?
And someone has figured out this would be over 14.5 million basket loads of dirt that were probably carried on the Indians' backs, load after load. So a tremendous expenditure of human labor, time, and material.
So that's what I said. We also got to look at it, and I would say this. The Indians, no disrespect, because I respect the Indians, but the Indians, because I have Indian blood, but understand this, they still lived in many primitive forms. So they couldn't have been the same people building in stone.
To construct this mound, it wasn't all done at once. It was done in a series of stages. And from excavations and quarings we've done through the mound, we can identify many building stages. So perhaps as a leader would die, they'd burn down or tear down the old building on top, add more dirt, put up a new building for the new leader. So the mound gradually increased in size.
Monk's Mound stood at the center of what is often referred to as America's first great city. Archaeological data indicates that the site came into existence around 800 AD and flourished for around 500 years. Monk's Mound was one of the first examples of what has become known as the Mississippian culture. Large temple mounds are the primary feature that defines a Mississippian site, and these can be found throughout the Mississippi River Valley. Early theories about their construction claimed the mounds could only have been built with slave labor. That was certainly the prevalent view when race theories abounded. At that time, the mounds were often compared to Egypt's pyramids, but today, these theories have been rejected.
So let's look at it. These some ancient maps right here. So a lot of time we watching these, you'll see these maps. I tell you that in Mississippi, when I look at Dolph, and I look at a lot of them boys from from Mississippi, they kind of, if you look at Dolph and all of them, they got a similar look. They got a very distinctive look. And like, when I'm thinking not Mississippi, but I'm saying where Dolph and them from, in Memphis. They got a very, very distinctive look. A lot of the artists and rappers out of Memphis and Tennessee, right? But if you go to Mississippi, you'll get these similar things. Understand, these populations, these places, these are like the most racist places on the planet, right? Or the most, it's a reason why they held subjective. But pay attention to everything that they flash in front of you. Jennifer, what up? Quinn, how you?
What happened to the great civilizations of ancient America? At one point, the Mississippi River Valley was one of the most populated and inhabited places on Earth. The earthworks constructed up and down the river were some of the world's most impressive structures ever accomplished. But for some reason, the remnants of a massive ancient civilization that lies under our own feet is nowhere to be found in the historical narrative. Why is that? Did these people contribute nothing to the history of the world?
Because you can't enslave and conquer a nation of people and then educate them and tell them that their ancestors founded civilization here in America, right? And structures and all this. You can't do that because then you'll start to make these people wonder.
Why has the Smithsonian promoted the idea that any American history prior to Columbus would be thrown out of the historical record? Theories about the savagery of the Indians didn't fit the magnificence of these earthen civilizations that spread across the country. Europeans would quickly adopt many racial theories involving them.
Those are burials. They still exist today. They're burials.
Root civilizations who constructed the earthworks. As long as the works wouldn't be attributed to black Indians and could rather be associated.
It says in 1997, Ohio Historical Society, this Ohio signed a lease until 2078 with the country club NBCC Mountains secured to provide some public area and land. Some senators believe that the country club is an inappropriate use of sacred site. This has been increasing public interest in earthworks. So this site right here where you got the circle mounds going around it is a perfect circle. It's in a country club, but really that's not there. So this is what's going on. There's a lot of these areas that we too poor, they done took over. They got a lot of our ancient sites around it, and we have no idea about it. You know what I mean? And they've been studying this shit for years. You know what I mean? So they basically they signed a lease with Ohio made them sign a lease at 2078. They can't really do nothing with it. They can't touch it.
With races of people who were considered non-American. These theories would eventually settle on the falsity that Asians who traveled across the Bering Strait were the first people to populate the Americas. This was an answer the whole academic community could support. The first Americans were not black or Negro. They were Asian. And not a civilization or race of people unto themselves. This essentially shut the case on the ancient history of the Americas. The continent was...
That's what we call the Folsom people. The world, you know, we don't think, but thousands of years ago, the continents was a little closer. Everything is spreading out, you know what I mean? From floating. The continents are floating except for Africa. Now, They believe the Folsom people came over the flaps coming from Asia over the top when it was still like ice to walk across. And they came over and they mixed with, but they tell you that the Folsom people came over and they mixed. But then these people getting darker and darker and darker. Well, who the fuck did they mix with? You know what I'm saying? So that's what these pictures, when you see the pictures of the Native American, of like these, or that guy that they show you on TV all the time, he was Sicilian. He wasn't even from America. But this is what they mean by the Folsom people. The Indians, they show up as like the Folsom people, which is mixtures of who they call the Folsom people from Asia and the indigenous that they act like they don't know. But these people, you see how dark this nigga is over here? They throw him in a corner.
Uninhabited until the Beringia migration. There was only one problem. There is no anthropological or archaeological evidence of any civilizations in pre-Columbian America being peopled by anyone but primarily Negroes. There is zero evidence for morphological characteristics of excavated bodies in burial mounds to have any Asian or Eurasian characteristics.
So, not in any of the tombs. When they went in the Grand Canyon and put out them Pharaoh tombs, when they was in the Mississippi, when they was in Memphis, when they was in all of these areas pulling out them ancient bodies, not one was Asian, not one. They were all Negroid.
This essentially blows the top off any race theory that says Negroes did not inhabit the Americas prior to Eurasians. For this reason, pre-Columbian history of the Americas has been redacted from the classical historical narrative. To unravel the true history of America is to unravel the true history of Europeans. And if this were done, we would all see that all academically accepted history is a mountain of lies fabricated to push European superiority. Not only were the Indians savages, but they had no language and built nothing of significance. These lies permeate academia unto this day. If you let an Egyptologist tell you, the discoveries made by the French during their invasion of Egypt opened the world for the first time to the history of ancient Egypt, which had previously gone unknown. Again, we should ask, how? How could Egyptian history have been unknown? Remember, at the supposed fall of Egypt, at the end, it was a Roman province. France, Italy, and Spain were under Roman rule and have been under Roman rule unto this day. Imagine the history of Florida being completely unknown to New Yorkers for over 3,000 years. But also during that same time, Florida and New York were being ruled by the same country. Once again, why would it take Napoleon 6 weeks to cross the Mediterranean?
A newly launched replica of the French frigate Hermione is now in mid-Atlantic, plowing her way westward toward the U.S. East Coast. She's retracing the voyage in 1780 of the original Hermione, whose mission was so crucial she may have been one of the most important warships in U.S. naval history and the most forgotten. The original was built for speed, and so, according to her crew, is the copy. And the British were so impressed they brought the Concorde to England, where the Royal Navy made line drawings of her to find out what made her so good. Those drawings are now in the British National Maritime Museum,
the main mast with the
where Jeremy Mitchell is their custodian. It was a fundamental British, at least curiosity, if not admiration, for the kind of ships the French were building in that era.
That's right, yes. And
why?
They had a reputation for being faster, for being a more nimble ship. And it was always kudos for a French ship to be captured and then given to a British officer because of that reputation.
Ever struggling upward with the passage of millennia, man pressed eastward and northward as far as the great ice cap would permit. At last the world's climate grew warmer, the ice cap began to retreat, and finally a means of progress was opened from Asia across narrow Bering Strait. Some unknown Columbus discovered America perhaps 10,000 years ago. Southward were more favorable climes, and these first inhabitants of America spread and multiplied. Civilizations rose and fell. From one of these...
Do you notice that this map isn't like the maps we see in school? I'll show you something. Why is America on the other side? Because they showing it from the back view? Okay. But this is what they're saying. I'm showing you the Bering Straits. They're trying to say they came up here. They walked across when everything was closer. Right? This the shit that they told us in school.
In what is now Mexico, centuries ago, an upsurge of culture poured into the region of our lower Mississippi Valley.
The true history of North America was purposely destroyed during Western expansion. Any remnants of ancient civilizations were plowed, excavated, looted, burned, flooded, and even blown up.
Hold on 1 second. Commercial life.
This was not just done to clear land for development. Indeed, some of the largest cities in America today are built upon massive Indian civilizations and burial grounds. But also, these cities were built upon Indian civilizations to make the history concerning the Indians vanish into oblivion. But one could ask, why would they destroy a people's entire history? Wouldn't they stand to learn something from the native people of the land? Although these are valid questions, they are missing one critical point that lies at the heart of every European. If they tell the truth about how highly civilized and advanced these people were, how would they be able to take credit for their achievements? And as you know, the heathen prides himself on stealing the works of men and claiming them for his own. So is there any proof that the advanced mathematic, geometric, or astronomical technology used to build the pyramids of Giza was in practical application anywhere else on Earth between 2750 BC and the year 1798? When, according to Egyptologists, it was lost only to be recovered by the French in Egypt. And furthermore, can we prove that these methods of astronomical construction were in practice prior to the discoveries by France? If this basic point doesn't hold up, the entire field of Egyptology can be called into question. In fact, all of ancient Egyptian history need be redacted. If the day should come when the most honored and awarded Egyptologist is questioned about the history of pre-Columbian America in comparison to ancient Egypt, he will be at a crossroads of conscience. Lie and advance his career, or tell the truth and ostracize himself academically, and never work for an accredited college or university.
These sorry motherfuckers got a statue of Ramesses. I believe that's Vegas. They took the real one.
Again.
And the reason why they put him in Las Vegas, it's a reason. That's why I be telling y'all the Nefertiti's tomb, she's pouring a cup of water that only flow like the Mississippi River. Come on, y'all. Y'all gotta feel me on this shit that I've been showing y'all. In the Nefertiti's tomb in Egypt, in Africa, right? What we call Africa, she's pouring a cup of water, and the only river in the world that flow that direction is the Mississippi. That's where she comes from. She married in over there.
One of the first scientific excavations of a mound was done by the man considered the father of Northern American archaeology, Thomas Jefferson. In 1781, after excavating a small burial mound near Monticello, his home in Virginia, Jefferson had no doubt that this and other mounds in the area were the work of American Indians.
Some from her tomb as well.
In the mid-1840s, the first fairly extensive study of mound sites was conducted by two men working out of Chillicothe, Ohio, Ephraim G. Squire, a local newspaperman, and Edwin H. Davis, a physician. They excavated at nearby Mound City and also explored a large number of other earth mounds and enclosures. Their findings were published by the recently established Smithsonian Institution. They concluded that some of the earthworks were sacred enclosures and that the people who had built them were skilled mathematicians and engineers. Unfortunately, after bringing this ancient American heritage to light, the two men had a falling out, and Davis sold his collection of artifacts for $10,000. With no reliable federal or state legislation existing to protect these sites, the destruction and looting of the mounds and their buried treasures became a critical problem.
They were very obvious. People excavated them purely out of curiosity, with no record keeping whatsoever. One instance that I know of, a farmer was removing a burial mound, found a copper artifact, and used it to repair his shovel. There were Mississippian mounds that were dynamited and artifacts hauled out in wheelbarrow loads and sold to people right on the spot, and the collection dispersed all over the country.
The Spiro Mound site in Oklahoma became known as a veritable treasure trove of artifacts. In the early 1930s, it was labeled the King Tut's Tomb of the Arkansas Valley because it was being ransacked by a mining company that had control of the land. The local citizens were outraged and pressured the Oklahoma legislature into passing an antiquities law in 1935. Unearthed at this site was one of the best preserved and largest of the Mississippian figurines, a human effigy pipe standing 11 inches tall. The adornments, the cap, braid, beaded necklace, and feathered cape, give us a rare portrait of a member of the elite of that particular society.
Look at him, yo. He look like a South African.
Does this artifact look Asian? Does this artifact look Caucasian? This perfectly preserved remnant found in the heart of America resembles what some would call a Negro. Inevitably, in depiction after depiction, Indians have been whitewashed into Euro-Mongoloid hybrids. But the bodies that were exhumed from the burial mounds were all Negro. Quote from Crania Americana, an inquiry into the distinctive characteristics of the Aboriginal race of America by Samuel Morton, renowned American anthropologist. It must be noted that Samuel Morton was also a eugenicist who promoted the idea of Caucasian superiority. Quote, "It is an adage among travelers that he who has seen one of the Indians has seen them all. So much do the individuals of this race resemble each other, notwithstanding their immense geographical distribution and those differences of climate which embrace the extremes of heat and cold. The half-clad Fuegan, shrinking from his dreary winter, has the same characteristic lineaments through an exaggerated degree as the Indians of the tropical plains. And these again resemble the tribes which inhabit the region west of the Rocky Mountains, those of the great valley of the Mississippi, and those again which skirt the Equinox on the north. All possess alike the long, the lank, the black hair, the brown or cinnamon-colored skin, the heavy brow, the dull, sleepy eye, the full, compressed lips, and the salient but dilated nose. These traits, moreover, are equally common to the savage and civilized nations. Whether they inhabit the margins of the rivers and feed on fish, or rove the forest and subsist on the spoils of the chase. It cannot be questioned that physical diversities do occur, equally singular and inexplicable, as seen in different shades of color varying from a fair tint to a complexion almost black, and this too under circumstance in which climate can have little to no influence. So also in reference to stature, the differences are remarkable in entire tribes, which moreover are geographically proximate to each other. These facts, however, are mere exceptions to a general rule and do not alter the peculiar physiognomy of the Indian. Physiognomy physiology of the Indian, which is as undeviatingly characteristic as that of the Negro. For whether we see him in the athletic cherub or the stunted Shayama or the dark Californian or the fair Bora, he is an Indian still and cannot be mistaken for being any other race.
To the greatest day of 2021.
That's when he shot the nose off that shit.
This is one of the world's biggest secrets. In fact, the only accepted pre-Columbian theory is the Clovis first Beringia migration model, because it can be used to fit into their modified premise. All their attention isn't targeted toward finding the truth about ancient America, but instead securing evidence to further push their false proclamations. Their attention isn't targeted toward finding the truth about ancient America, but instead securing evidence to further push their false proclamations. The evidence clearly exists, contrary to their efforts to suppress. But the people will idolize their public figures and their supported and backed institutions of perversion. For example, if a black person living in America thinks they are liberating themselves by identifying as a black or African, they are living a double lie, neither of which is true. Black is a color, also meaning legally dead in the eyes of the law. Africa is a continent from which none of their ancestors are from. This is an idolized institution of perversion, a spell cast over the minds and souls of the blind and the wicked, who seek answers from those immoral institutions for the comfort of a good night's sleep in a bed of lies. A well-intentioned fool is still a fool indeed. Why do we blindly accept their answers as true, when the same people who are providing the answers are guilty of conspiracy, theft, and murder? All of these institutions are guilty as charged, and this goes beyond a shadow of a doubt. So why do you keep believing their lies when it comes to your history? To be continued on the next episode of America is Egypt.
Yeah, this is dope. The name of this is America is Egypt. That's episode 4, so it's a whole bunch more. I thought that was dope. I seen a lot of it's crazy, you know what I'm saying? So I'm gonna move on to the next video, which was, if y'all want to catch this, called America is Egypt. You know what I mean? Now we're gonna go to my favorite part. I'm gonna help break this down. It's called The City of Gods. You know what I'm saying? They're gonna show you ancient civilizations. They ain't gonna tell you they're us, but pay attention. Commercial life. They always gonna play a whole bunch of shit that don't matter.
In 1860, a French naturalist was cutting his way through the Cambodian jungle in search of exotic insects. Henri Mouot suddenly came across the last thing he was expecting: a massive complex of stone temples. Mouot had stumbled across one of the world's most astonishing and enduring architectural feats: the 900-year-old remains of Angkor Wat. But who built these vast, sophisticated temples? Why construct them deep in the jungle, only to abandon them? At first, there were no answers. Then, an amazing eyewitness account from the 13th century emerged in China. The author describes the great Temple of Angkor, a fantastic citadel, and its resourceful inhabitants. How could this be true? The evidence was scant. Now science is providing unexpected proof. Archaeologists are applying the latest techniques to reveal the mysteries of Angkor. And radar images from space reveal that Angkor was much bigger than originally imagined. A vast city, the size of London. Scientists now know that Angkor Wat was just a small part of one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. Angkor Wat, one of the world's true enigmas, its size and purpose baffling. Larger than any cathedral, it is truly one of the greatest structures ever built. Its towers, shaped like lotus flowers, were raised 100 years before the Cathedral of Chartres in France.
And now, I'm gonna stop you here. We know that on the walls in what we call Egypt, they always have pictures of the lotus flower, right? And they're saying that the temples are shaped like the lotus flower. But these are China. You know, they're going to show you these light-skinned Chinese people. At the time when this existed, there were no such Chinese people. I'm not making this up. Do your research. A lot of these races, or what we call different types, only been around for a couple thousand years.
The buildings are laid out on a vast scale. Stone shrines ascending one upon the other as if reaching for the heavens. Endless corridors are carved with the longest reliefs in the world. The precise construction would be hard to match even with lasers used by modern surveyors. Archaeologist Charles Hyam has studied all aspects of Angkor and its inhabitants, the Khmer. Professor Hyam has been crucial to understanding the extraordinary history of this ancient culture.
We are standing in the middle of the world's largest religious monument. It's absolutely gigantic. It stretches on and on. Angkor Wat was the temple mausoleum of one of Angkor's greatest kings, King Suryavarman II, the Sun King. And when he died, his ashes would have been placed under the heart of the central lotus tower behind me.
Angkor Wat, meaning Holy Temple, is symbolic in every way. Its vast square moat represents the oceans around Mount Meru, legendary home of the Hindu gods. When Henri Mouot stumbled across Angkor in 1860, he wrote, "One of these temples, a rival to that of Solomon and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome." The Frenchman suspected that the temples belonged to a huge and sophisticated civilization, but he had no evidence. Angkor Wat lies in the northwest floodplains of Cambodia, just above the Great Lake. When Mouot discovered it in 1860, only a handful of Buddhist monks and local villagers lived around the ancient site. None of them knew how Angkor Wat had evolved or who had built it. Legend had it that the Great Temple had built itself. Some said that it had always been there. In Europe, the publication of Mouot's journal created a sensation. Soon, a stream of explorers, photographers, and archaeologists traveled east, keen to uncover the mysteries of this vanished world. But Henri Mouot's part in this puzzle came to a sudden end. Bitten by a poisonous insect, he died in the jungle a year after discovering the incredible site.
Or did they kill his ass?
As early explorers began to strip away the jungle, they discovered even more temples. The wall...
See, they always say, like, oh, he died, or if he was in the excavating, opening old stuff, like, you know, the dude that opened King Tut's tomb, that air that stuffed in bacteria so old to kill you.
The walls of the vast monuments were covered in intricate carvings. These reliefs illustrate legends of an ancient culture and its religion.
Pause. What color was this wall? See how dark they are? See, it's old, so all it has to do is be repolished. But what color are these people? Oh, okay. So you believe that they didn't know what color the things they were using? But it's so old that a lot of you can tell they always use stone and then they always colored it in. But you can see what the color was.
The sandstone sections were carved in...
Boom! I ain't capping with y'all. Look, this... What you have to understand is that as we moved and built different empires, and you see these people looked a little different, but they were dark as hell. So when you see the original, when they tell you that the first empires of China and in these areas of Asia they were still Africans, or what we call Africans, you see what I mean?
Place. They would have taken the artists decades to complete. Inscriptions here are written not only in an ancient Cambodian language, but also, mysteriously, in Sanskrit, the priestly language of the Hindus.
No, in Sanskrit, the original language of the so-called Saharan desert people, or the what we call like the Africans, or the more Sanskrit is the oldest language found. So it's telling you they had translated in multiple languages, and the only people that knew multiple languages was us, because we created all the languages.
One of the great breakthroughs has been the translation of the entire corpus of Angkorian inscriptions by a French scholar, Georges Sedez, in 7 thick volumes. And so, bit by bit, the actual internal history of Angkor has been unravelled, and that's been absolutely critical.
To the code breakers, they disclosed that for 6 centuries Angkor had been the capital of the Khmer, the indigenous people of Cambodia. Between the 9th and 15th centuries AD, a total of 38 kings ruled their empire from Angkor. Its borders reached from southern Vietnam to Laos, and from the Mekong River to eastern Burma. But whose grand vision was this great city? And why was it built in the middle of the jungle? The deciphering continued. Then an astonishing discovery was made. A junior Chinese official on a diplomatic mission visited Angkor in the summer of 1296 AD. During his year-long visit, Zhou Daguan kept a journal. His diary tells of a major civilization, a capital much bigger and more developed than the archaeologists dared imagine. But was Zhou Daguan's account fact or myth? Archaeologists searched for proof of the existence of the city Zhou described. As they pieced together this gigantic puzzle, the full story began to emerge. For thousands of years, the indigenous people of Cambodia, the Khmer, had cut rice fields from the jungle. These farmers were a largely self-contained and peaceful race. But from the 1st century AD, small feuding kingdoms developed around the country. In the 8th century, a great leader emerged. To find a site for a brand new sacred capital, he abandoned his home city in the eastern part of Cambodia and ordered all his subjects to cross the Mekong River in a great march west. Having conquered his rivals, he chose the lush land between the sacred Kulen Hills and the Great Lake for his new citadel. In 802 AD, he had himself crowned Jayavarman, the supreme world emperor, king of kings. Jayavarman's charisma won the people over. He came not only to rule by divine consent, but to be worshipped as a god himself. At a stroke, this great and charismatic leader changed the course of Cambodian history. Over the next 500 years, Jayavarman's descendants, living gods, succeeded him to reign in Angkor. Each king had his own monument built to his glory, destined to become his mausoleum. Since the 2nd century AD, the Khmers had practiced Hinduism. Each of the royal temples is modelled on the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the home of the Indian gods. For their builders, the shrines were a celebration of religion, art, science, and power. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Cambodia was part of France's colonial empire. It was they who led the way in piecing Angkor together.
When they arrived and took colonial control of this part of the world, the place was an absolute shambles. I mean, there were stones just lying around everywhere. It was nothing like what you see today. And so they dedicated vast amount of energy and effort into the reconstruction of the temples.
In the 1960s, the eminent archaeologist Bernard-Philippe Grolier made this comparison of Angkor. Imagine that within the city limits of Paris, you found thrown together Versailles, the Place de la Concorde, and the Louvre. Surrounding these, the cathedrals of Notre Dame, Chartres, and Rheims, flanked by all the churches built in Paris before the 19th century. Since Henri Moore had first discovered Angkor in 1860, much had been learned about its history.
Look at the big lips on these motherfuckers, man. You know what I'm saying? And these same long ears are found in South Africa. They do that practice with their ears. And they still running around with arrows and beads like Africans and shields. So what's so different? How they wore their hair?
But almost nothing was known about the culture responsible for these incredible monuments. The largest religious monument in the world, the City of the Gods.
As always, worst thing that ever happened to the internet was damn commercials.
Angkor Wat in the heart of Cambodia. But is this astonishing temple only the visible tip of a greater unseen mystery? 700 years ago, a junior Chinese official visited Angkor on a diplomatic mission. During his 11-month stay with a Cambodian family, he recorded many aspects of life in Angkor. But Zhou Daguan's account contains several flights of fancy. For instance, he describes the great temple of Angkor Wat as having been built in a single day by a legendary Chinese architect. He was also openly judgmental, referring to his hosts as barbarians. Archaeologists have taken his writings with a pinch of salt.
You've always got to think of it as being seen through the eyes of an educated Chinese, for whom anyone beyond the empire was, by definition, a barbarian. And in reading what he has to say, one has to be, certainly on occasion, judicious in realizing that the prejudices were there.
For 100 years, French archaeologists were too busy restoring the temples to pay the journal much attention, so it was largely ignored. Then, in the 1970s, the murderous regime of Pol Pot stopped all work at Angkor. His army of communist revolutionaries, the Khmer Rouge, laid thousands of landmines around the site, rendering it off limits for years. Now at last, stability has returned to Cambodia, and work on the temples has resumed. Today, Angkor has World Heritage Site protection, with a dozen countries funding archaeological research. With much of the major restoration work complete, the focus has shifted away from the temples at the center and onto the outlying pieces of the puzzle. Just north of Angkor Wat, an 8-mile wall encloses the remains of several magnificent stone temples. Explorer Henri Mouot suspected in 1860 that this was once the Khmer's great capital of Angkor Thom, the holy city. The perfectly square wall, like Angkor Wat, is surrounded by a moat and covers an area the size of Manhattan Island. At its center is the Bayon Temple. In his journal from 1296, Zhou Daguan describes a busy city teeming with life. Archaeologists are now looking for evidence that this is the great metropolis he was describing. But any evidence has all but vanished under dense forest. In the last 2 years, archaeologist Jacques Gaucher has started to excavate the interior of the walled city.
When I started this study, we knew almost nothing because everything was covered in forest. The only surviving features were the stone temples and the foundation of a royal palace, but we knew nothing of the rest of the 900 hectares within the city wall.
For a while, it seemed that Gaucher was fighting a losing battle, but his persistence is at last producing results.
After 2 years of very difficult research, we've at last begun to build an impression of this city.
Gaucher is plotting thousands of coordinates onto an ever more detailed map of Angkor Thom. He is now able to trace an intricate grid system of canals and roads, together with the sites of thousands of wooden houses. Back in 1860, when Henri Moore discovered Angkor Wat, he had suspected that it was just part of a complex city. Zhou Daguan's 13th century journal alludes to a political and religious citadel. Now, at last, archaeologists have enough evidence to bring to life this extraordinary city as it looked 700 years ago. Angkor was a capital far bigger and far in advance of any European city of the time. Jacques Gaucher's findings confirm the accuracy of Zhou Daguan's account. What he describes is fact, not fantasy.
These are the monuments which have caused merchants from overseas to speak so often of Cambodia the rich and noble. If you are looking for gold lions, gold Buddhas, bronze elephants, and bronze horses, this is where you'll find them.
From the inscriptions, archaeologists know that Angkor Thom, the holy city, was built nearly a century before Zhou arrived by the Khmer's greatest monarch. Jayavarman VII ruled over Cambodia between 1181 and 1219. Known as the Great Builder King, he expanded the empire further than any other Khmer ruler.
First of all, if you understand language, that was a female's name. It ended in I, and we'll leave it alone.
Within the city walls, the king built a palace befitting his mighty empire.
The royal palace stands to the north of the Golden Tower. Lintels and columns, all decorated with carved and painted Buddhas, are immense. The roofs, too, are impressive. Long colonnades and open corridors stretch away, interlaced in harmonious relation.
Jacques Gaucher's excavations at the royal palace confirm Zhou's account.
We found evidence that this palace was a large area with interconnecting courtyards and buildings. We found holes 80 centimeters in diameter for huge supporting columns. It would have been a very impressive sight.
As evidence materializes about the royal palace, the role of the Khmer's rulers, these earthly gods, becomes clearer.
Clearly the building's made out of stone. They keep showing you these damn wood buildings. That's what be getting on my nerves when I be watching these docs.
During his stay, Zhou Daguan had several audiences with the ruling king.
Every time I was admitted to the palace for an audience with the king, he came forward with his chief wife and took his place in the embrasure of the golden window in the main audience hall.
Zhou himself came from a culture with the ruler elevated to godhood. The Chinese approved of the Khmer's devotion.
These people know what is due a king.
The king topped a social pyramid that stretched down to the lowest peasant. The monarch's potency showed itself in a legend Zhou Daguan relates.
Out of the palace rises a golden tower, to the top of which the ruler ascends nightly to sleep. It is common belief that in the tower dwells a genie, formed like a serpent with 9 heads, which is lord of the entire kingdom. Every night, the genie appears in the shape of a woman with whom the sovereign couples. Should the genie fail to appear for a single night, It is a sign that the king's death is at hand. If the king should fail to keep his tryst, disaster is sure to follow.
Well, I'm not sure about that. He would have been a fine king had he been able to do that for any length of time. But what we do know is that it was a practice of the aristocrats to send, and the regional landed gentry, as it were, to send up a woman from their family to be a member of the king's entourage, to become a concubine, which would, in a sense, bind the provinces to the centre in a very physical manner. And it wouldn't be surprising if indeed the king did have a very substantial harem from which to choose.
Zhou Daguan notes that the king had 5 wives and a harem of 3,000 women. The king was rarely seen outside the palace, but Zhou describes one such occasion, the New Year festival.
As night comes on, the king is besought to take part in the spectacle. The rockets are fired and the crackers touched off. The rockets can be seen from 13 kilometers away. The firecrackers, large as swivel guns, shake the whole city.
Below the king was an army of bureaucrats graded by rank, as Zhou describes.
In this country, there is a hierarchy of ministers, generals, astronomers, and other functionaries. Beneath these come all sorts of small employees, differing only in name from our own.
These would all have been descendants of families honored by the original Jayavarman, who had founded Angkor 500 years earlier.
I told you, they really...
What is not...
It's really old, but... That's what like a black marble look like if it's super old and hasn't been like polished. And I'm not being funny because I tell you everywhere ancient was these dark people. Big lips, big noses. And you see this had color, so this right here is like reddish. But they made sure, like that's why I always say like, yo, by the time they let people see it, they scrub these walls. That's why they all look so old, but if you look closely, you can see that it was either black paint or whatever, but you can see the complexion.
As Zhou describes.
In this country, there is a hierarchy of ministers, generals, astronomers, and other functionaries. Beneath these come all sorts of small employees, differing only in name from our own.
These would all have been descendants of families honored by the original Jayavarman, who had founded Angkor 500 years earlier. What is not clear from Zhou's writings is how many people lived in Angkor. Sanskrit inscriptions in temples such as Ta Prohm offer valuable clues.
We know that the temple housed at least 12,000 people, including a number of great priests, I think over 650 dancers and various other officiants to maintain the temple and to do the necessary temple duties.
Rich, what up?
If 12,000 people served a single temple, what was the overall population? Jacques Gaucher's new research is not yet complete, but it does support an educated guess.
To give a number, this city could have been between 80,000, 90,000 and 150,000 people.
In the same period, the population of London totaled no more than 30,000.
Free. Free, free, free.
So, discoveries are confirming that what Henri Mouot suspected and Zhou Daguan alleges is correct. Angkor Thom was indeed a large, well-structured city with a huge population. Now suspicions are aroused that the jungle conceals an altogether bigger surprise. A metropolis so vast that its full extent can only be detected from space. The search for the hidden empire of Angkor was about to take an unexpected turn. In 1994, archaeologists persuaded NASA to undertake a unique task. The space agency had developed specialist radar to penetrate vegetation. Their challenge was to probe the area of Angkor in Cambodia as the Space Shuttle Endeavour passed over Southeast Asia. The resulting images cover an area 100 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. For the first time, scientists have an accurate impression of the wider city's infrastructure 1,000 years ago. Covering an area the size of London, this rural metropolis was immense. For archaeologist Elizabeth Moore, this is a major breakthrough.
Central statue. I'm sure they have the skill to do it.
It is revolutionizing understanding of the size of the kingdom.
Water up.
At first people said, well, you won't find anything new at Angkor, but we have. What the radar has shown us is just how all the regions contributed to what then became the central zone of Angkor.
The radar pictures also reveal previously unknown temples all over the Angkorian basin, as well as an intricate network of roads and canals, all leading to the walled city. Evident for the first time is the grid plan of this once great metropolis.
When you start looking at the radar imagery and you see the sophistication with which they were able to control and alter their terrain, I've never seen a culture like it elsewhere in Southeast Asia in terms of manipulating the landscape, of using it to their benefit.
Because they can't, because one day we're going to realize that apparently these builders, or this royal knowledge of learning how to build, people took voyages different places as if and it was us. It was like we took voyages and we used our skills to build the same way we do with anything else we do, and took this all over the world and constructed civilizations and temples. And that's why they said, like, well, nowhere else in this area because it didn't come from the area.
Now, the challenge for archaeologists was to work out at ground level what had been photographed from space. Archaeologist Christophe Potier is using the images as a route map to trace the layout of ancient Angkor. The newly discovered temples were at the center of their own communities. Just like village churches in Europe, they indicate the size of each settlement, showing the true extent of the metropolis. Today, Potier and his Cambodian assistant, Sin Chenda, attempt to locate a number of previously unrecorded ruins outside the walled city of Angkor Thom.
Wow, super. It's a quite nice one. It seems to be a Garuda, and you see very clearly the Garuda with his wings is like an eagle, and quite interesting. Unfortunately, it has been badly damaged, but it's nice. And compared to the style, it could be a late 9th century, maybe first part of the 10th.
Temples like this would have been the centers of villages housing between 100 and 300 people. Potier and his colleagues have established that the number of temple sites like this in the region runs into thousands, suggesting a massive population. There was a direct relationship between these villages and the royal capital. An ancient inscription persuades archaeologists like Charles Hyam of the link.
We know that at least 80,000 or so people from 3,000 villages were assigned to supply all the goods that we needed annually to maintain it in a good condition.
Vast amounts of produce and thousands of people would have been transported from the villages. A complex network of roads leading to the center is evident from the NASA pictures. The inscriptions point to the great builder king, Jayavarman.
Jayavarman VII was a fantastic builder. Across his whole kingdom, he had roads constructed. He was a great man for infrastructure, one reason being that he wanted pilgrims to go and visit his places. And so he had rest houses built at one day's journey apart. He moved and shaped more stone than every other Angkorian king combined. And he must go down in world history as one of the great builders.
Lil Dicky.
I'm Lil Dicky.
Lil Dicky.
Call me David.
Man, I can't believe it.
Great builders of all time.
If all the outlying temples were connected in one giant conurbation, then Angkor can be acknowledged as a rural metropolis, as big as modern-day London. At its heart, a walled royal enclave the size of Westminster.
There are hundreds, let's say thousands of that kind of small sanctuaries spread all around the area of Angkor, but the large area of Angkor. And it's that show, obviously, then there was village everywhere, almost everywhere.
Early research suggests that this metropolis could have had a population of 1 million people. This would make Angkor, at its peak, between the 11th and 13th centuries, one of the largest cities in the world. The indigenous Cambodians, the Khmer, were powerful and successful. They managed to build one of the most extraordinary cities in history in one of the world's most hostile climates. But how was such a large population able to survive and prosper in the heart of an inhospitable jungle? The answer lies in the Khmer's ability to harness their most precious asset. Cambodia has 8 months without rain, when rivers become a muddy trickle. Then, for a few months, the monsoon brings floods. For this reason, Angkor is built close to the Great Lake, which swells to 4 times its size in the rainy season.
Just like in Egypt, but just like in Mississippi. You see how all of these are built around lakes? It's the same construction. It's the same ideas, using nature to its benefit.
It not only provided precious water throughout the year, but also an inexhaustible supply of fish. Zhou Daguan records,
"Of all the fish, the black carp is the most abundant. Next in number, the tench and freshwater congers. The prawns of Channan weigh as much as half a kilo apiece. Crocodiles there are as large as boats."
Apart from fish, the staple diet, like most of Asia, was rice. Paddy fields need a plentiful supply of water to ensure a healthy crop. When the founding ruler Jayavarman arrived at Angkor, there were already peasant farmers cultivating ancient rice fields. But from the 9th to the 13th centuries, successive god kings ordered thousands more acres of jungle to be cleared for rice production. Water had to be cleverly harnessed to irrigate the new fields. If the system failed, the very survival of the kingdom would be at stake. Well-maintained canals were also crucial to Angkor. Every day, tons of heavy stones for the construction of temples would be transported by canal from the Kulen Hills, 50 kilometers away. Planning expert Jacques Gaucher believes the success of Angkor is due to the elaborate system of interconnecting waterways.
You have tanks or ponds which are dug to keep also this water, and you have some canalization. This royal palace is full of small canalization. The city is full of channels, and the outside, the territory, is also full of big channels. These systems, which are at different level of scale, they must have been connected to each other.
It was the Khmer's ability to harness water that made them unique. While the Dutch were experimenting with their first canals, the Khmer were already past masters. The most recent excavation by Jacques Gaucher reveals the complexity of Khmer water management within the royal city. His surveys have uncovered 2 huge reservoirs, each measuring 300 meters long and 20 meters wide. A major road intersected them. Water needed to flow around the city. What Gaucher wanted to know was how the road could be used while water still flowed from one reservoir to the other. So he began to dig. The excavation unearthed a stone dike where the road and reservoirs met. It also shows that the reservoirs were built on slightly different levels. Beneath the surface of the road, narrow channels in the dike allow water to filter from the upper reservoir into the lower. But the arrangement may have been too finely balanced.
Playing at such a scale with the management of water, with such small differences of level, I think the system was quite fragile. And if there were any variability in the environment or in the maintenance of the city, from social problems or political ones, I think the precision, I mean the ultra sophistication can have been a weakness in the system in a way.
This complex system provided water throughout the royal city for drinking, cooking, and even bathing.
Cambodia is an excessively hot country, and it is impossible to get through the day without bathing several times. There are no bathhouses, no basins. However, every family has a pond, or several families have one in common. Men and women go naked into this pond.
The construction of extensive water systems and great stone temples in the jungle demanded colossal manpower. Why would the Khmer be prepared to devote so much of their year toiling in the king's name?
Why was it that the peasantry out there in the fields contributed so much labour, willingly it seems, to the maintenance of the centre? And the answer may well be that they really believed that the king was a god, and they were working in the service of the deity, and this kept them going.
Oh, I think without a doubt, I fully agree with you. You couldn't have built the city of Angkor without that kind of firm belief.
But although the Khmer people dedicated enormous effort into constructing their great city, it was the addition of slave labor that made it possible. Zhou describes these unfortunates.
Wild men from the hills can be bought to serve as slaves. Families of wealth may
Wild men from the hills, cave dwellers. You keep hearing the same story. We heard yesterday they did the same thing in Persia.
Zhou describes these unfortunates.
Wild men from the hills can be bought to serve as slaves. Families of wealth may own more than 100. Those of lesser means content themselves with 10 or 20. Only the very poor have none.
We know, too, again from the inscriptions, that some of them had a very raw deal. There was one who tried to escape from the land in which he was born and was assigned, and they found him, and they brought him back, and they gouged his eyes out and cut off his ears.
Punishment was severe for all subjects of Angkor, noted the Chinese diplomat.
In very serious cases, a ditch is dug outside the city. The criminal is dropped into it. Earth and stones are heaped on top until he is buried alive. Lesser crimes are dealt with by cutting off feet or hands, or by amputating the nose.
The economy of Angkor was based on international trade. The Khmers produced food for their swelling population, but there was a surplus for trade with neighboring states. They wove fine cloth, cast huge bronze statues, and exported ivory, kingfisher feathers, beeswax, and scented wood. Their main trading partner was China.
The reliefs of the Bayonne reveal a Chinese trade junk coming across the waters of the Great Lake just south of Angkor. And we know that there was indeed a great deal of trade going on because of the more recent archaeological research that has been excavating in the Royal Palace, and there they've been unearthing a considerable quantity of Chinese ceramics.
Zhou Daguan's delegation were not the only Chinese in Angkor. In fact, Chinese settlers had been there for years.
The Chinese always take a wife here as soon as they arrive, deriving additional benefit from the woman's business skills. In Cambodia, it is the women who take charge of trade. There are no shops in which the merchants live. Instead, they display their goods on matting spread on the ground.
So in China, at that time, those people that we would consider the indigenous of China, they didn't, their men did everything. But these people who lived in the middle of this forest, so they don't know how they got there, they claim, their women were more controlled. Doesn't it sound like ancient our people?
Women held positions of power and authority.
Just like the ancient Nubians, they said that the Nubians, their women held equal rank.
They owned property, engaged in trade, and even served as bodyguards to the king.
Wakanda.
But the Chinese interest in Cambodian women was not driven solely by trade.
Everyone with whom I talked said that the Cambodian women are highly sexed. 1 or 2 days after giving birth to a child, they are ready for intercourse. If a husband is not responsive, he will be discarded.
By the end of the 13th century, Angkor was at its peak. A succession of god kings had built this beautiful and astonishing city. A sophisticated water system made the city work, fed its people, and created wealth. But then, at its very peak, cracks in the system began to appear. Cracks that would lead to the city being abandoned to the jungle. It took nearly 500 years for Angkor to grow to the vast city that the Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan described in 1296. Yet just a century later, the city lay deserted, given up to the jungle. But why? Throughout history, there are few examples of cities being totally abandoned.
The new house is amazing.
Except there's this
rare problem.
More than likely, it was like a natural disaster. Or something happened. So that's what I would think. Because for them just to leave a city is almost rare.
One key factor is known. Throughout Angkor's history, the Khmer had waged war with their neighbors. In the early years of Angkor, the Vietnamese Chams were the Khmer's sworn enemies. Most of the temple walls around the capital depict epic battles against the Chams.
niggas had like
But by the
animal
time of
faces.
Zhou Daguan's visit,
The Cham had, they was like human with like animal faces, yo. Pay attention. Look at this. Look at this. Look at how they look. Look at this. See this shit? They were like, either they was disformed, or like they was shit deep.
in the early years of Angkor, the Vietnamese Chams were the Khmer's sworn enemies. Most of the temple walls around the capital depict epic battles against the Chams. But by the time of Zhou Daguan's visit, the main threat came from the emerging Thai kingdom of Siam as it expanded into Cambodia. He recounts,
recently, during the war with Siam, whole villages have been laid waste.
In the diplomat's eyes, the Khmer army was ill-prepared for war.
Soldiers move about unclothed and barefoot.
They call it either they call it the Khmer and then they call it the Khmer, and it has nothing to do. These people don't know nothing about each other.
In the right hand is carried a lance, in the left a shield. They have no bows, no missiles, no breastplates, and no helmets. Generally speaking, these people have neither discipline nor strategy.
Inscriptions show that in 1431, the Thais sacked Angkor. They looted everything possible, enslaving much of the population, including the king's entire harem, and carried them off to Thailand. Abandoned, the city of Angkor was slowly reabsorbed into the jungle from which it had emerged 5 centuries before. Henri Mouat wrote in 1860, "One must ask, what has become of this powerful race, so civilized and enlightened to create these gigantic works?" The conventional explanation is that the empire's rulers lost their grip on power, and the Thais simply scared them off. But the mystery of Angkor takes another twist. Today, archaeologists believe that there were other factors at work. Charles Hyam points to the great builder king, Jayavarman VII.
Perhaps because of the excesses of Jayavarman VII, who clearly was a builder with a frenzy of activity. And he may well, it's said, and it might be true, that he exhausted the resources of the state and it went into a decline.
Jayavarman VII was the first Buddhist king after several hundred years of Hindu worship. This more compassionate religion may have given the Khmer cause to reflect on the excesses of their kings.
And I wonder whether, in fact, the slow decline that may well have set in was the result of a lack of belief out in the fields there that the king was in fact a deity, and that this vital link between the two began to fray.
Jacques Gaucher theorizes that while the Khmer's success can be attributed to the harnessing of water, it could also have led to their undoing. Such was the fine balance of nature that if irrigation and the storage of water were not kept up, they could easily fall into disrepair.
Le système à ce moment-là devient fragile et on voit très bien.
The water system was very fragile because it was so sophisticated. And the problem is, if it's not well maintained, it could easily become blocked by sediment.
The kings who came after Jayavarman VII were less interested in grand building plans. It's also possible they stopped maintaining the intricate water system. Deforestation was also a likely contributor. So much jungle had been cut back for rice growing that undoubtedly the rivers and canals would have silted up, which in turn would have led to an ecological disaster for the Khmer. Christophe Potier believes the clues are obvious.
The pound is very clear there with the water.
At the end of Angkor, it's pieces of the forest should have been very, very rare. Very. So deforestation is not a new problem. It's an old one.
It is most likely that it was a combination of these factors that led the Khmer to abandon their once great city. What remained of the Khmer court re-established itself on the banks of the Mekong, near Cambodia's present-day capital of Phnom Penh.
We're not talking about the actual collapse and total demise of a civilization. What happened was that they moved sensibly to the east, down to the Mekong River, and away from the ties.
Now completely Buddhist, renouncing material wealth, the Khmer would never again embrace the lofty heights they had in Angkor. For 400 years.
So it seems like from with everything they did, with all the resources, the stones they took, the food, the land, they overly used it, and it caused disaster. The water probably got dirty or everything, and that's why they said they moved east and they all turned into Buddhists and never vowed to never go back again. From the mistakes that they learned from doing all, they had a beautiful city, but they had destroyed the land and it caused issues, and they probably said, you know what, I'm done. And they changed their way of life in 1,000 years to see what happens when you live at that height. You know what I mean?
Angkor lay derelict and forgotten until its rediscovery by Henri Moore in 1860. Today, Angkor is recognized as a wonder of the world. In Cambodia's new era of stability, archaeologists from around the world continue to make fresh discoveries. At last, a world lost to the jungle is re-emerging. A major metropolis that for over half a millennium dominated a thriving empire. One of the greatest cities the world has ever known.
As I always tell y'all gonna realize, the name of this is the City of God Kings. This one. And my last vid of the day is Britain's role they played in slavery. That's my last video today. And I'm gonna play some of it. I'm not gonna play it all.
Time to ice up for summer.
Right. Yeah, commercial.
England in 1837 had enjoyed more than 200 years of prosperity and global power. That success had been fueled by the slave trade. But within 12 months, slavery would be abolished. A new monarch, Victoria, was crowned. This should have marked the end of the story of slavery. In fact, the Victorians replaced shackles of iron with the poison of racial prejudice. Today, thousands of Britons are discovering their own part in the shameful history of Britain's slave trade. A history which is only now forcing its way back into our consciousness.
We have developed a kind of amnesia about history. It's an amnesia which you can understand. It's an amnesia that comes from a sense of guilt, a desire not to remember the past, because to remember the past is to remember a troubled and anxious and sometimes barbaric set of realities.
To most Britons today, the Caribbean islands are just a holiday paradise. But away from the sandy beaches, these islands hold the secrets of a forgotten history. Great houses stand empty, a mute testament to 400 years of British occupation. The graveyards of the Caribbean are a record of the personal history of a few privileged families.
Some of the worst aspects of slavery are that memories are broken and chains of memory are broken. And one of the differences between coming from the sort of family I come from is that there's a record.
This is the resting place of one of the oldest surviving West Indian families. Its descendants today are only just coming to terms with their history.
All the codicils of the wills say, "And I bequeath to my son." And the first item is always slaves. And I rang up my mother and said, Did you know that the Warners had slaves? And she said, "Of course not, darling. Never, never. Of course they didn't have slaves." And it was completely naive of me to have imagined that a Caribbean family would not have been involved in that economy.
For over 300 years, the Warners played the part of a successful upper-crust English family. Their most famous son, Sir Pelham, captained and managed England's cricket team at the turn of the century. But he learnt his cricket back home, in the Caribbean.
Chapter 1, West Indies. I was born in the Isle of Trinidad in the West Indies, where my father was at one time Attorney General. And my earliest recollections of cricket are of batting on a marble gallery to the bowling of a black boy who rejoiced in the name of Killibree. The glass windows of the bedrooms which ran along this gallery were often broken, and my father would say that I should come to a bad end. But perhaps he derived consolation from the bowler, who used to remark, "Beg pardon, sir, but I tell you, sir, Mr. Pelham, he make a fine bat, sir, when he grow big."
Marina Warner's grandfather is part of a history which stretches back more than 3 centuries, but which the family had chosen to neglect.
I had known my grandfather as a shrunken old man in South Kensington, and that this is where he started was a huge surprise.
This is a history that takes some forgetting. It goes back to 1624, when Charles I gave Sir Thomas Warner this royal charter to colonize 4 Caribbean islands.
The said Thomas Warner hath lately discovered 4 several islands in main ocean, toward the continent of America. The one called the Isle of St. Christopher, another the Isle of Nevis, another Barbados, and another the Isle of Montserrat, which said island are possessed and inhabited by savages and heathen people,
And have caused divers of our subjects of this our realm to remove themselves to the said islands with purpose to proceed in so hopeful a work. So that's the beginning of colonization of the Caribbean.
The Warners are just one of many.
I told y'all when you hear the word barbarian heat and all that, when they're writing it, they talking about us.
Families who rose on the backs of slaves. At least a dozen still hold titles which were awarded or bought following their success in slavery. Baron Ashburton of the Barings banking dynasty inherited a slaving fortune, as did Viscount Cobham. Lord Liverpool is the descendant of slave owners, and the ancestors of Earl Harwood, the Queen's cousin, made the equivalent of £1 million from their slave holdings. Most slave-owning families have long since lost all record of that past. They have erased the history of Britain's slave descendants. Two centuries before the Empire Windrush brought immigrants to post-war Britain, ships had already carried thousands of stowaways, sailors, and servants across the Atlantic, all of them former slaves. Today, many of their descendants still live here. In the archives of Liverpool Library, one young man is seeking a link to his slave past. Lawrence Westgarth's family has lived in this city for at least 7 generations, but their story begins much earlier.
My ancestors were transported on ships as cargo, not as passengers, as literally as cargo, and to be bought and sold. It's something that I found hard to deal with. I personally don't feel it's worth getting angry about. I feel that people need to channel their energy into ways which are constructive. I see it as a quest.
Lawrence knows that his ancestor came here from the Caribbean over 150 years ago. His name was Robert Cox. This certificate shows his marriage in Liverpool in 1822. The records also say that he was a mariner, but beyond that, they are silent.
I couldn't tell you anything about Robert Cox.
He was a mariner today, like he was on the seas. You know what I mean? And I told you that Christopher Columbus in history, tells you, they never made it to America, they made it to the islands.
For me, he's just a name. He's a name on a birth certificate. He's a name on a marriage certificate. But in many ways, the connection of all my ancestors who I've traced is strongest with him, because I identify with him in a way which is in many ways signifies the same type of position I'm in. I feel in many ways that I'm searching, and I'm sure he felt the same, because him coming here and settling here was almost like was a journey. He was finding the place where he would feel at home, as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that he settled here tells me, well, you know, maybe the fact that he found a home here means that other people can find a home here.
Robert Cox found employment in the warehouses and docks of Liverpool, where black and Irish immigrants lived and worked side by side. Generations later, they are still neighbors. Through his work as an acupuncturist, Lawrence has met Catherine Hodson. As a young girl, Catherine lived next door to Lawrence's great-great-grandmother, Mary Ellen Antone. Mary Ellen was the granddaughter of the family's first arrival, Robert Cox.
So what was Mary Ellen like?
She was an average build, like. She wasn't fat or anything like that. She had a nice, round, pleasant face. And I always remember the thing that she used to have crinkly hair, but the edges of it seemed to be tinged with white. And as a child, it used to fascinate me. But she was always a very pleasant person. And she'd always sit on the chair at the top of the steps, like, the door wide open, and as children we'd pass and say, hello, Mrs. Antone.
Was Mrs. Antone fair-skinned or dark?
Oh no, she wasn't very dark. No. She was quite light-skinned, really. Mr. Antone was more dark because he was a different nationality, you say. But Mrs. Antone, no, she was quite light-skinned. Well, like you, she was. Yeah, quite light-skinned, Mrs. Antone. And but she was always she was there. She was Mrs. Antone. She was a neighbour. She was there.
Did anybody ever talk about slavery or the slave trade at that time?
No, not really. No, and I don't ever remember anything getting said about slavery at that time. Like it, we didn't actually know really anything about that. Like, you know, we weren't educated enough to know anything about that. It's only this later years that we've heard anything really about it.
Slave traders and merchants' money built 19th century Liverpool. Their contribution is honoured everywhere. The part played by Lawrence's slave ancestors remains unrecognised.
The entire town hall is adorned with the portraits of slave traders, and in many ways, you know, the opulence that's associated with that trade can be seen in this building. And in saying that, that makes me feel like I almost have a connection to the building because it was off the backs of the slave trade that it was built. Now, my ancestors were the people who, you know, were the victims of that trade. And I guess me coming here and looking at the building and making that connection is my way of acknowledging the role that they played in the building of the whole city. I mean, the place is truly magnificent. It's breathtaking. I mean, the amount of work that must have gone into actually building something like this must have been unbelievable.